Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to talk about best practices for API design. Whether you are building RESTful API, GraphQL API, or something else, designing your API properly is crucial for making it easy to use, maintain, and scale. In this video, I will share some key principles and best practices to keep in mind when designing your API. Before we dive into the best practices, let's talk about why API design matters. An API or application programming interface is how different parts of your application communicate with each other. It's also how your application interacts with other systems and services. A well-designed API can make it easy for developers to integrate with your application, reduce errors, and improve the overall developer experience. On the other hand, a poorly designed API can lead to confusion, bugs, and increased maintenance costs. That's why it's important to get it right from the start. If you are building a RESTful API, following REST principles is essential. REST, which stands for Representational State Transfer, is a set of architectural principles that guide the design of APIs. These principles include using standard HTTP methods like GET, POST, PUT, and DELETE, and organizing your API around resources. For example, if you are building an e-commerce API, you might have resources like products, orders, and users. Each resource should have a unique URL, and your API should use the appropriate HTTP method for each action. For instance, use GET to retrieve data, POST to create new data, PUT to update data, and DELETE to remove data. Consistency and predictability are key to a good API design. Your API should have a consistent structure and naming conventions. This makes it easier for developers to learn and use your API. For example, use consistent naming for your endpoints and parameters. If you use camel case for one endpoint, don't switch to snake case for another. Also, make sure your error messages and status codes are consistent. If a developer encounters an error, they should be able to predict what the response will look like and how to handle it. API versioning is another best practice you should follow. As your API evolves, you may need to make changes that aren't backward compatible. By versioning your API, you can introduce new features and improvements without breaking existing integrations. One common approach to versioning is to include the version number in the URL, like the following. This makes it clear which version of the API the client is using. You can also use other methods, like versionings in the header, but the key is to ensure that clients can continue using the old version if they are not ready to upgrade. Documentation is critical for any API. A well-documented API makes it easy for developers to understand how to use it and reduces the need for support. Your documentation should include clear explanations of each point, the parameters it accepts, the responses it returns, and any error codes that might be encountered. Tools like Swagger or Postman can help you create interactive API documentation that allows developers to test your API directly from the documentation. This can greatly improve the developer experience and make your API more accessible. Security is a crucial aspect of API design. Always implement proper authentication and authorization mechanisms to ensure that only authorized users can access your API. Use HTTPS to encrypt data in transit and protect against man-in-the-middle attacks. When dealing with sensitive information, make sure to follow best practices for data protection. For example, avoid exposing sensitive data directly in your API responses. Use tokens for session management and implement rate limiting to protect your API from abuse, such as DDoS attacks. Another important aspect of API security is input validation. Ensure that all input data is validated and sanitized to prevent security vulnerabilities, like SQL injection and cross-site scripting. You should also handle errors gracefully and avoid leaking sensitive information in error messages. As your application grows, your API needs to scale efficiently to handle increasing traffic. Designing your API with scalability in mind will help you avoid performance bottlenecks and ensures that your application remains responsive under heavy load. One approach to scalability is to design your API in a stateless manner. This means that each request is independent and doesn't rely on previous requests. Stateless APIs are easier to scale because you can distribute requests across multiple servers without worrying about maintaining session state. Another important consideration is to design your API to handle pagination, filtering, and sorting. When dealing with large datasets, these features can help reduce the load on your API and make it more efficient. Handling errors gracefully is another critical aspect of API design. Your API should provide clear and consistent error messages that help developers understand what went wrong and how to fix it. Use a standard HTTP status code such as 400 for bad requests and 404 for not found to indicate the nature of the error. Additionally, your error responses should include meaningful error messages that provide details about the issue. For example, if a required parameter is missing, your error message should specify which parameter is missing and why it's important. To make your API more user-friendly, you can also provide links to your documentation or support resources in your error responses. This can help developers troubleshoot issues more effectively. And that wraps up our discussion on best practices for API design. We have covered key principles like using RESTful principles, designing for consistency, versioning, documentation, security, scalability, and handling errors gracefully. By following these best practices, you can create an API that's not only functional but also easy to use and maintain. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so that you won't miss any future videos. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Assalamu alaikum.